I'm very humbled to be here. After all, this is where macroeconomics begin, and we are joined by Lord Keynes. So I'm really feeling the history as they were standing here talking. But I think after what happened to Japan and what's happening around the world, I think we are also bringing something back to Lord Keynes. And I think I'll add toward the end that we finally found what was missing in Keynesian revolution all along. But I'll get to that a little later. This recession, we went through a lot of very heavy lifting. I mean, massive capital injection, liquidity injection, zero interest rates, quantitative easing, massive fiscal stimulus, budget deficit, problem with rating agencies, you name it, we tried it. And then we are still, I mean, we have heard some recovery stories from Mr. Cassidy, but we are still like 5-10 years before the peak in terms of industrial production and many other economic indicators. Why is this the case? And there's a lot of confusion among policymakers about what is the right thing to do in a circumstance like this. Well, I'm happy to tell you that we in Japan went through all of this. All of these, bank, capital injection, zero interest rate, quantitative easing, you name it. And to those of us in Japan, this looks like a replay of what happened to us 10 years ago. And many of you might object to the idea that Japan was the basket case. How can you compare us with Japan? Well, I like to start by this chart, which shows what happened to US house prices and Japanese house prices exactly 15 years earlier. And you see both the duration and the magnitude of increase and the decrease are very, very similar. And I was recently told that I was in a conference in Boston end of last year, that because this chart has made it to so many people through the internet, that the reason US housing prices are stabilizing now is because they saw that the Japanese house prices are stabilized, so it's a good time to buy. Now, I don't believe that for the moment. It sounds too good to be true, but it does look very, very similar. And what's happening here is that against this massive fiscal decline in asset values, central banks all around the world lowered interest rates dramatically, as you know, but with very little effect. If you look at the level of industrial production in the United States today, it's back to the level of 2003. I mean, with interest rates where they are and has been there for such a long time, we should be expecting to see 3 or 4 bubbles. But this is where we are now, and this is where we were before. And Europe, same story. We are talking about recovery, but the level of industrial production in Europe is of 2000. It's 10 years ago. With all that interest rate stimulus, fiscal stimulus, we're still back down here. Why is that the case? Why are not seeing more bubbles or more stronger economic reaction? Well, for lowering of interest rates to do any work, borrowers have to be out there borrowing money. And even though you have heard a lot about the bankers not lending money, because bankers not lending money is a front page news. And I understand that there are a lot of journalists in this crowd, so I have to be careful here. But when bankers are not lending money, you can write a lot about it. But how about the borrowers? If the borrowers are not borrowing money, it's never a front page news. But this is the data from Senior Loan Officers Lending Survey by the Federal Reserve. And I made a diffusion index out of it. If it's below 0, that means the demand for fund is falling. Because the way the question is asked is that compared to 3 months ago, are people trying to borrow money or trying to pay back debt? And the fact that we are still below 0 in the United States with 0 interest rates means that there is no demand for funds in the US. And the same story is true in Europe. ECB conducts the same survey, and it's still below 0, even with this very low interest rates. I mean, the second derivative is improving compared to the shock after the Lehman, but the fact that the number is below 0 means demand for fund is still contracting. even with zero interest rates. And how do we get a world like this? I mean, we were taught in economics that when you bring rates down to zero, the demand for funds is supposed to pick up. Well, we in Japan lived through this world for 10 years. This is the amount of funds Japanese companies raised from both the capital market and the banking system. And the other line is the short-term interest rates. And during the bubble days, of course, people borrowing money and investing like crazy, and Bank of Japan was raising interest rates to cool the economy. In 1990, the bubble burst, and as you can see, demand for funds started coming down very sharply. Economy was weakening. Bank of Japan also dropped rates. By 1995, short-term rate in Japan was almost zero. And look what happens to demand for funds. It stays negative for full 10 years. Companies paying down debt in an environment of zero interest rates. We never learn this in economics or in the business schools because these things are not supposed to happen, right? When companies pay down debt with interest rate at zero, that means corporate executives are so stupid they can't find good use for the money even with zero interest rates. But if that's the case, those companies should just give the money back to the shareholders and let shareholders find something else to do with the money. So these things are not supposed to happen. But in Japan, it happened for full 10 years. Some of the bigger years, the amount of debt repayment is over 30 trillion yen a year, 6% of Japan's GDP. And why is this so bad? Or why did it happen, first of all? Well, we know why it happened, because asset prices collapsed here. Japanese commercial real estate prices fell 87% from the peak, nationwide. So just imagine London down 87, Cambridge down 87, Manchester down 87, Edinburgh down 87. What kind of economy do you think we have left here? Well, that's basically what happened in Japan. Once the asset prices collapsed, liabilities remained. People realized that they had balance sheets underwater. But many of these companies had plenty of cash flow. Japan continued to run one of the largest trade surpluses in the world throughout this period. So they had a cash flow, but the balance sheet's underwater. And if you put any corporate executive in that position, with balance sheets underwater but with strong cash flow, what would they do? It doesn't matter whether you're Japanese or German or English or American. There's only one thing to do. Use the cash flow to pay down debt. Because for all the stakeholders involved, that's the best thing to do. Because shareholders don't want to be told that their shares are just a piece of paper now because the balance sheet's already underwater. Or the workers don't want to be told that they have no more jobs. Bankers don't want to be told that it's all non-performing loans. But if you continue to pay down debt, at some point the balance sheets will be balanced again. All of these problems will go away. So everybody will be telling corporate executives to do just that, and that's what happens as a result. Well, that's the right thing to do at the micro level. If I were running one of those companies, I would have done the same thing. But when everybody does it all at the same time, we run into a massive fallacy of composition problems, because in a national economy, if someone is saving money or paying down debt, you better have someone on the other side borrowing and spending money, or else the whole thing will contract very, very quickly. Just to give you a numerical example, if I have $1,000 of income and I spend $900 myself, or usually my wife spends it, and $100 we decide to save, the $900 is already someone else's income. That's not a problem. But this $100, it goes through people like us, the financial types, and we give it to someone else who can best use the money. And that person spends it, and then 900 plus 100 against the original income, $1,000, economy moves forward. If there are too many borrowers, interest rates are raised, and some people drops out. If it's too few, you bring interest rates down, and some people raise hands, pick up the remaining pieces, and then the economy moves forward. That's the usual world. But what happens in this world? You bring rates down to zero, absolutely nothing happens, because people with balance sheets underwater will not want to borrow money at any interest rates, and there won't be too many lenders to these guys either, especially if they know that their balance sheets are underwater. And so nothing happens. The $100 gets stuck in the system. Then the 900 is already spent, so the 900 is someone else's income. If that person says, let's save 10%, spends 810, saves $90, the $90 gets into the banking system, it gets stuck. After all, this is 10 years. So the money gets stuck again, economy is down to 810, another round 730, another round 600 something. That's what I call balance sheet recession. This is driven by a completely different force. Well, everybody trying to repair the balance sheets all at the same time. And the last time something like this actually happened was the Great Depression in the United States, 29 to 33, where US lost 46% of GDP in just 4 years because US fell into that cycle. Well, that was bad enough. In Japan, with 6% of debt repayment by the companies and 4% of household savings on top of it, we could have fell into exactly the same pattern. 4%, 6%, 10%. If you lose 10% every year, you could lose 46% in 6 years, in 4 years. So I have a little summary of what I call balance sheet recession. There's no word for this recession, so I just call it balance sheet recession. If you can come up with a better name for it, I'm happy to use that one. Now, we have nothing better to do. You can read this. But what's important for future is the last 2 points. And that is that if the economy is suffering from balance sheet recession, where people are minimizing debt instead of maximizing profits, economy will never enter self-sustaining growth until private sector balance sheets are repaired. That's the first point. And the second point is that if you try to reduce government spending in this type of environment, unless you are absolutely certain that the money that the government refused to borrow, will be borrowed and spent by the private sector quickly, I'm afraid fiscal reform will fail. And those of us in Japan, we tried it in 2 occasions, 1997 and 2001, and both ended in massive failure. In 1997, we listened to the IMF and the OECD and those people who know nothing about anything. They told us to cut the budget deficit, and we tried that. Well, economy collapsed massively, 5 quarters of negative growth, and then we hit the banking crisis. Our budget deficit actually skyrocketed, increased by 60-some% instead of declined by the same amount. And again, we tried that in 2001, tried to limit the budget deficit to 30 trillion yen. That didn't work either because the economy was collapsing, budget deficit actually increased. And so this point that if the government is the only borrower taking the money and putting the money back into the income stream, you have to make sure the private sector is really healthy and coming back to borrow money before government can embark on fiscal stimulus, because if you don't, the whole thing will come crashing down. Now, so what can we learn from the Japanese experience? This is the Japanese economy in a nutshell. During the late 80s, commercial real estate prices in Japan, commercial real estate led the bubble. In the US, it was the other way around. Commercial real estate went sky high, and GDP also went up very sharply. Now that anyone can explain. That's no brainer. But what's remarkable about the Japanese experience is what happened afterwards. Our commercial real estate prices fell down 87%. Japan lost wealth equivalent to 3 years' worth of GDP just on shares and land from what happened to this, the bubble bursting. And look at what Japan's GDP did over this period. It never fell below the peak of the bubble. So with the entire private sector paying down debt massively, and then we losing wealth equivalent to 3 years' worth of GDP, commercial real estate down 87% nationwide, and we kept our GDP from falling. I think that was quite remarkable. How did we manage to do that? Well, the answer is very simple. Our party was called Liberal Democrats, were running the show. We're highly liberal with public spending. So as soon as the economy began to weaken, they said, let's build roads and bridges, get the economy going. They split the fiscal stimulus, the economy began to improve. They said, it worked. But once the economy began to improve, what happens? People who have nothing better to do start saying, the budget deficit is too large. And you're going to use grandchildren's credit card. All of those arguments are coming in. Economy seems to be improving. So they cut the budget deficit. Economy weakened again. Of course, because the private sector was all deleveraging. And then another group, and then we had to put in another fiscal stimulus. Economy improved. And the same thing happens. So, economy is improving. This time, pump priming is working. Let's cut. And the economy weakens again. And we had this zigzag for full 15 years, which is why it took us 15. But at least, as you can see, government spending increased during this period, even though the revenue fell. And in spite of this zigzag, which I thought was very unfortunate, we ended up spending something like 460 trillion if you include the structural part as well as the cyclical part. But I would argue that 460 trillion was still money that was very well spent. 460 trillion is 92% of Japan's GDP. So that much debt we added to whatever we had before, and that's no peanuts, I agree. But if you go back to this chart and just imagine what would have happened to Japanese economy if the government failed to do that. Well, with everybody paying down debt, commercial real estate prices collapsing, chances are high that Japan's GDP would have fallen massively. Perhaps not to the level of what happened during the Great Depression, but probably to the level of 1985. Japanese bubble started in 1986, so probably to the level before the bubble began. If that happened, and GDP fell to the level of 1985, 1 year before the bubble, the gap between what actually happened and this likely path of GDP without the fiscal stimulus, if you add this over the 15-year period, it's well over 2,000 trillion. So 460 trillion bought 2,000 trillion GDP. Not a bad deal. And the reason you don't get this argument in the press is that, there's a lot of press here, so I better be careful, is that the assumption is that even if you do nothing, GDP will be zero. And against this zero, you spend 460 trillion and GDP only went up by a little bit. And that's why we get bashed. But as you just saw earlier, with commercial real estate prices down 87%, everybody paying down debt, to assume that with no actions, the economy would have stayed at zero is preposterous. It would have fallen like a rock. So the point is that if we see private sector deleveraging, and private sector is deleveraging in this country, in the US, and many other parts of the world, we cannot really afford to cut a budget deficit. We have to maintain a fiscal stimulus until private sector sorts are ready to take over the borrowing jobs again. Now, I have to go very quickly because I don't want to take up all your time. But this is the flow of funds for the UK. And as you can see, savings are increasing for the private sector as well as for the corporate sector as well as for the household sector. So people are deleveraging in this country. You have to keep the fiscal stimulus in place. And my sense of what's happening in the world is in this chart, and that is the bubble burst 2007, and I think the whole world entered the balance sheet recession. But it did not have to fall the way it did, except for this policy mistake on Lehman. I used to work at the New York Fed, and I handled Latin American debt crisis. I was the syndicated loan desk officer at the New York, New York Fed when it happened, 1982. And it was a massive crisis. Everybody from Mexico down to the southern tip of Chile went bankrupt. And American banks, it was said 7 out of 8 money center banks were actually underwater. But with Paul Volcker's beautiful leadership, and I had to do all the dirty work, and I know what kind of dirty work I had to do. We did everything legal, illegal, paralegal, you name it, just to make sure that the thing won't collapse. We were able to overcome the crisis. And average people have never realized that there was a massive crisis going on. But the magnitude of that crisis was 10 times the savings and loan crisis, equivalent to what we are experiencing right now. But with proper central bank actions, you could keep the economy from feeling all the pain. Unfortunately, Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Paulson had no such ideas, let the Lehman go, and we ended up entering a free fall. Now, after we enter a free fall, both gentlemen realized that they dropped the ball, so they put in, according to the IMF, $8.9 trillion to turn the situations around, either in terms of government guarantees, capital injections, liquidity injections, whatnot. Now, if you throw $8.9 trillion at a policy mistake, naturally something will happen because it didn't have to be there. And I think that's the recovery we are seeing at the moment. But all the balance sheet problems that started the problem in the first place, most of them are still very much with us. So yes, we are recovering. We had a kind of a V-shaped recovery. But at some point, we will hit this limit of coming from this original balance sheet recession problems. And from this point onwards, the recovery, I think, will be tougher. Because up to now, we just have to end up, we just have to solve the panic coming from Lehman collapse. From this point onward, we actually have to repair thousands and millions of balance sheets. And that will take a long time. So I would say that this part, which didn't have to happen, was the easy part in terms of policy response. What we are faced with now is the hard part. We have to repair these balance sheets so that we can move forward. At the beginning, I said we have something to tell to Lord Keynes. I think what the Japanese experience have showed us, and what we are going through now, is that economy actually have two phases. Where the private sector is maximizing profits, that's what we learn in economics. And once every several decades, when these private sector source goes crazy, they're minimizing debt after bursting of the bubble. And once you're in that state, I call it, because I have no other good name for it, the yang, the Chinese for yang is the bright part, and the yin. And I'm afraid what we learn in schools are all about the yang part of the economy. Private sector balance sheets are clean, they're maximizing profits, but we are in the inside. The private sector balance sheets are underwater, and the people are repairing their balance sheets. And with US, UK, Spain, all on this side, Japan still trying to climb out of this massive bubble, we still need, I'm afraid, fiscal stimulus. But I contradict what Mr. Cassidy said about the fiscal stimulus. Oh, sorry, Mr. Samuelson said about fiscal stimulus. It is very difficult to maintain fiscal stimulus in a democracy during peacetime. And we tried to do that in Japan, myself and a few others. We kept on saying, no, we have to have a fiscal stimulus until private sector balance sheets are clean. But to no avail. We had this zigzag, 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 and that's why it took us 15. We could have finished that job maybe 7 to 8 years. Nothing shorter given the size of our bubble. But it didn't have to take 15. But in the democracy during peacetime, I'm afraid it's very difficult to maintain fiscal stimulus. And that's why we ended up having to go through much longer, having to go through this recession much longer. And when you go back to the works of Keynes, I think what was missing is this one point, that on occasion, private sector sources are minimizing debt. And what he was trying to explain in his general theory in 1936 was a balance sheet recession. But he did not cross the river. He remained with this concept of private sector maximizing profits. So he had to come up with a marginal efficiency of capital and other very complicated explanations trying to explain what happened. But once you put private sector minimizing debt into that, and everything he said start making sense. And in that sense, I think what we went through in Japan, 15 years of suffering, is not all in vain. We can learn from this experience that occasionally we are on this side, maybe once in 7 decades or so. But once you're on this side, you have to shift your mentality completely from our so-called neoclassical economics, private sector maximizing profits, and the balance sheet is always clean, to something very different. Because in this world, in the in-world, monetary policy is largely dead in the water, because if you bring rates down, nothing happens. There's no reason for anything to happen. But fiscal policy will be very effective because there's absolutely no crowding out problems. Any government spending would be better than no government spending, because if you do nothing about the situation, the economy will continue to contract. And so I think we all did the right thing last year, putting a fiscal stimulus. The challenge is to see whether we can maintain it until private sector balance sheets are repaired. Thank you very much.